Clara Hughes was back in the lab, where she had spent countless nights immersed in her experiments. Her latest creation, a device that captured neural messages from the recently deceased, finally seemed to be working. The project, which had once been an academic passion, had become a personal obsession. Clara believed that by listening to the final moments of people who had died under unusual circumstances, she could better understand the phenomenon of human consciousness at its final instant. That night, Clara was preparing to test the device on a new batch of recordings. With her headphones snug against her ears, she concentrated on the distorted sounds that began to echo through the lab. It was an intense process, demanding her full attention. The audio signals were recorded in fragmented bits, as if each word had been torn from the darkness. Clara was used to this: whispers, screams, gasps for air. But that night, something felt different. As she adjusted the controls on the device, Clara heard a sound that made her freeze. A whisper, clearer than the others, almost as if it were speaking directly into her ear. Clara. The voice sounded too real to be just a random recording. She pulled the headphones off, glancing around, making sure she was alone. She put them back on, pressing them tightly against her ears. The voice continued, soft but with a tone that sent chills down her spine. "Are you there? I have something to show you." Clara knew that no one should know about her project, let alone something as personal as her name. Her heart raced, and for the first time in a long time, she felt vulnerable in that lab, which had always been her safe haven. Determined to understand what was happening, Clara started tracking the origin of the recording. It was unlikely that her device was picking up anything in real time, but the more she investigated, the more convinced she became that this wasn't just a pre-recorded message. The voice was unlike the ones she was used to hearing, which were usually short, fragmented, and full of anguish. This voice felt aware, like it knew exactly who it was talking to. On her computer, Clara opened the file and began analyzing the audio frequencies. She noticed something strange: the sound wave pattern didn't match the pattern of previous recordings. She felt a chill when she realized that even when she slowed the audio down, the voice maintained a natural tone, something impossible for a pre-existing recording. Now she was certain, she was hearing something that felt like a direct communication, a message with purpose. As she looked at the screen, the device's display flashed, and the message repeated. "You'll find me where it all began." Clara froze, feeling as if she was being watched. The lab walls, once familiar and safe, now seemed to close in on her. She began to consider the possibility that someone was monitoring her work. Someone who knew too much, someone who was manipulating her discoveries for some unknown purpose. Perplexed and with her mind racing, Clara stored the device in the drawer and locked it. She tried to calm down, to rationalize it. Maybe it was just interference, a glitch in the system. But deep down, she knew she was denying what she had just heard. As she left the lab that night, Clara cast one last look back at the room. The feeling that something dark had been unleashed wouldn't leave her. The voice seemed to still whisper in her ears, even with the headphones off. She took a deep breath and finally left, a sense of unease following her out the door, as if she were being followed. The streets were empty, and the walk to her car felt longer than usual. As she walked, she wondered if it wouldn't be wise to shut the project down for good, but the curiosity gnawed at her. She needed to know more. Clara knew that from that moment on, her life would never be the same. Back in the lab the next morning, Clara couldn't shake the unease that had lingered since she'd left the building the night before. The voice still echoed in her mind, repeating that cryptic phrase, "You'll find me where it all began." She tried to focus on her work, but the tension was palpable. She needed to dig deeper, to figure out where that audio could have come from and what it meant. Clara started sifting through old files, searching for a connection with the sound wave pattern she'd heard. She pulled up her archive of recordings, looking for answers she wasn't even sure she wanted to find. So far, the device had captured hundreds of final word records from all over the country. Each recording was filed with details about the deceased and the circumstances of their death, but the mysterious audio from last night didn't match any of the files. As she compared the recent audio frequencies to previous ones, Clara noticed something unexpected. There were subtle similarities between the new recording and a series of files related to an old case, the case of Jack Dunning, a notorious serial killer who had terrorized the city a decade ago. Dunning's story was well known. After a string of brutal murders, he had disappeared without a trace. Some believed he was dead, while others thought he'd fled and changed his identity. Clara knew the story well. At the time, she had started developing her device with cases like this in mind. Her mind buzzed with questions. How could that audio be connected to Jack Dunning? He had supposedly died before Clara had even begun to record any data. Something didn't add up, but the similarities between the audio patterns were undeniable. Determined to dig deeper, Clara immersed herself in the records of Dunning's victims. She spent hours revisiting the files, listening to their final words, searching for any clue that might explain what was happening. As she listened, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The voices were different, but there was something in the messages that linked one recording to another, fragments of phrases that, together, seemed to form a chilling dialogue, as if somehow the victims were communicating with each other after death. The discovery shook Clara. She knew she was dealing with something much bigger than a simple technical glitch. If these recordings were real, it meant there was a deliberate pattern behind the murders. This wasn't just a serial killer taking lives at random. There was an order, a purpose that she couldn't understand. A shiver ran down her spine as she realized that the killer not only seemed to know about her research, but was using her technology in a twisted way. And worse, he was leaving messages that seemed directed at her. Clara felt a mix of fear and fascination. She knew she had to keep going, to see where this would lead, even if it meant facing a danger she had never imagined. Before shutting down the computer, Clara jotted down the strangest parts of the audios, fragments of phrases, bits of words, anything that could help her understand Dunning's mind and what he might be planning regarding her. She knew she was on her own with this investigation and that the police wouldn't believe theories involving a supposedly dead killer and messages from beyond. As she left the lab, Clara took one last look at the computer screen, feeling the weight of the discoveries she had made. She closed her eyes, trying to calm her mind, but the fear was real. The sense that she was sinking into something beyond her understanding followed her like a shadow. As she locked the door, a disturbing thought occurred to her. If the voice was correct, then she would need to revisit where it all began. She knew what that meant, and even though she was hesitant, she couldn't ignore the call. She would decide tomorrow, but her mind was already consumed by the investigation. Clara woke up determined to follow the clues that had surfaced the night before. She knew this path could prove dangerous, but she felt she had to understand what was really going on. Her investigation kept leading her back to Jack Dunning's victims, but one question haunted her: how could he be connected to the voice she'd heard in the lab? Everyone believed that Jack Dunning was dead, but something about the audios suggested otherwise. She began her day by reviewing her notes, organizing every message the device had captured from Dunning's victims. Normally, the recordings captured by her device were short and disjointed, fragments of words filled with pain, but devoid of any real connection. Yet the words she'd recently heard seemed different, as though there was a purpose behind them, almost as if they were aware. The hours dragged on as Clara reviewed recordings, compared frequencies, and looked for any detail that might clarify the connection. Then she noticed an unusual sound pattern that repeated across some of the older recordings. Small noises that nearly went unnoticed, but now Clara recognized them as some sort of hidden signature. Something Dunning seemed to use to communicate in a veiled manner. Increasingly intrigued, Clara decided to investigate more deeply what that sound signature could mean. As she compared the recordings with the information she had on Dunning, the tension in her chest grew. A pattern began to emerge, a code embedded in the recordings, as if he were leaving messages for someone to discover. Then, the voice returned. Clara was adjusting the device, headphones in place, when she heard the familiar, unsettling sound. "You know what you have to do, Clara." The voice seemed to fill the silence around her, almost tangible, as if someone were right beside her. She pulled the headphones off, looking around the empty lab, trying to calm her racing pulse. Determined not to give in to fear, Clara put the headphones back on, adjusting the device controls to try to trace the source of the communication that felt almost real. Suddenly, she realized that the messages seemed to follow a specific order. They were fragmented words, but when pieced together they revealed a path she knew all too well, the house where Jack Dunning had last been seen. Her heart pounded as memories of that case resurfaced. Back then, the investigations had led her to Dunning's abandoned mansion, but the place had been empty and authorities declared he disappeared somewhere in the woods surrounding the property. Now, the voice seemed to be guiding her back to where it all began. Clara knew she had to go there. If this was a game, she was willing to play, because she felt that her own safety depended on fully understanding what was happening. The idea that Dunning, or someone connected to him, might be using her device to manipulate her was disturbing, but it was a reality she could no longer ignore. With one last look around the lab, Clara shut down the computer and prepared to head to the old mansion. She knew that by crossing that threshold, she was stepping into unknown territory, but she felt she had no choice. The answers were there, and she had to confront them. As she left, a shiver ran down her spine. The feeling that something invisible was following her was almost suffocating. Yet she pressed on, determined to find out who was behind that voice and how Jack Dunning fit into this mystery, darker than she could have ever imagined. Arriving at Jack Dunning's abandoned mansion, Clara felt a mix of fear and resolve. It was the first time she had returned there since the initial investigation, a decade ago. Back then, the place had seemed just another derelict house, but now, surrounded by silence and shadows, the mansion seemed to have a life of its own. Clara made her way through the dusty entryway, past aged furniture and peeling walls. Her footsteps echoed through the halls as she headed to the basement, where authorities had found incriminating evidence, though not Dunning himself. Even though the police had thoroughly searched the place, Clara felt that something was still hidden there, something only she could uncover. When she descended the stairs to the basement, she found it exactly as she remembered. The air was thick with a musty, ancient smell, and shadows seemed to shift as Clara switched on her flashlight. Her heart pounded as she spotted an old trunk in the corner of the room. She knew it hadn't been there the last time she was in the mansion. Carefully, Clara opened the trunk, revealing a scattered collection of documents. There, among yellowed papers and newspaper clippings, was Jack Dunning's journal. The pages, scrawled with messy handwriting, revealed the twisted, meticulous side of the killer, with detailed notes on each of his victims. To her shock, there were even references to Clara herself, vague and unsettling, as if he had known all along that she would one day investigate him. As she flipped through the pages, Clara discovered something even more disturbing, a connection between Dunning and the development of her device. She found copies of old patents, notes on experimental technologies, and one name that made her blood run cold, Dr. Henry Collins, her former mentor. He had been the one who'd guided her through the early stages of developing the technology she had now perfected. The truth began to emerge with a chilling clarity. Dr. Collins had worked with Dunning, not only helping him remain hidden but also advancing techniques to capture the final words of his victims. Clara felt a wave of revulsion and betrayal, realizing that all of this was part of a larger plan. Dunning and Collins, it seemed, had developed the concept for the device together, using real victims as test subjects. Clara stood up, overwhelmed by a mix of anger and disgust. She had trusted Dr. Collins, and now she saw that he had manipulated her from the beginning, handing her a technology tainted by horrific crimes. Feeling both betrayed and vulnerable, Clara realized she needed to confront her former mentor, but the fear that he might still be operating in the shadows left her paralyzed. As she started to leave the basement, Clara heard footsteps from upstairs. Her first reaction was panic. Someone else was there. Leaning against the wall, she switched off her flashlight and waited in silence. The footsteps were careful, almost calculated, and made her think it could be Dr. Collins himself, aware that she had uncovered the truth. Determined to face whoever was there, Clara climbed the stairs with steady, cautious steps. She was ready to confront the truth, whatever the consequences. When she reached the top of the stairs, however, she found no one. The silence that followed was even more oppressive, as though the mansion itself were holding its breath along with her. Before leaving, Clara took one last look at the basement, taking with her the journal and documents that would prove the connection between Dunning and her mentor. She knew that her next step would be to confront Dr. Collins and uncover whatever else he was hiding, but a new sense of danger hung over her. As she left the mansion, she realized that from that moment on, her life would never be the same. With Jack Dunning's journal in hand, Clara knew she couldn't avoid the truth any longer. She returned home, spending the night rereading every page, preparing herself for what was to come. Her next step was clear: she had to confront Dr. Collins and get the answers she so desperately needed. Clara knew that meeting him could be dangerous, so she armed herself with recordings and notes exposing the link between Collins and Dunning. The next morning, Clara drove to Collins's house, tucked away in a secluded part of town. As she arrived, she noticed that the property was in a state of disrepair, with broken windows and an overgrown yard. Entering made her feel exposed, but the urge to confront her former mentor was stronger than her fear. Clara took a deep breath before knocking on the door. To her surprise, Collins was there, as if waiting for her. He greeted her with a cold, calculating smile, inviting her in with a false sense of hospitality. Clara sat down, and the confrontation began. Collins didn't bother denying anything. In fact, he seemed almost proud as he admitted to his involvement with Dunning. He revealed that he'd always been interested in pushing the boundaries of human consciousness, and Dunning had been the perfect tool to experiment with his creation. As Clara listened in shock, Collins explained how he had used the device to study the final words of victims, to expand his understanding of the mind's final moments. To him, it was all just one big scientific experiment, and the fate of the victims was merely an inevitable cost of progress. Clara felt a surge of anger rising within her as Collins spoke with a detachment that made her skin crawl. When Clara mentioned Dunning's journal, Collins was unfazed, as though he already knew she'd found it. He provoked her, suggesting that she herself was part of the experiment, and that her obsession with the victim's last words made her an ideal successor to carry on the research. Clara realized that Collins had been manipulating her from the start, guiding her discoveries and fueling her desire for answers. In a burst of rage, Clara accused Collins of being as much a killer as Dunning. To her surprise, Collins laughed off the accusation, as if he found it naive. Then, he revealed that Dunning had never actually been dead, but hidden under his protection, somewhere Clara would never find him, where he could continue his work. Now, however, Collins was ready to test one last time her ability to solve the mystery. Collins gave her a terrible choice: she could destroy the device, ending forever the research she loved, or she could use it to try and track down Dunning, assuming the legacy Collins believed she was meant to carry. Clara realized that no matter what decision she made, she was playing the game Collins had set up for her, but she had no choice but to face it to the end. With the device in hand, Clara knew she had reached the point of no return. She accepted Collins's challenge and left his house, determined to find Dunning on her own, but with a newfound resolve. In her mind, there was only one thought: she had to put an end to this once and for all. She was willing to risk everything to expose Collins and erase every trace of his macabre experiment. As she walked away, Clara felt a new energy growing inside her, something that pushed her to keep moving forward. She knew that the final confrontation was near and that she wouldn't get another chance to uncover the whole truth. Collins had thrown down the final challenge, but Clara was determined to win. Back in the lab, Clara prepared the device for one last mission. Collins's challenge haunted her, but the urgency to put an end to this once and for all kept her going. There was no more room for doubt or hesitation, and Clara knew this confrontation would be decisive. Either she would stop Dunning and Collins's network, or she would fall victim to it. She adjusted the device to scan for any nearby frequency that might indicate Dunning's presence, expanding the usual search range as she mentally prepared herself for what lay ahead. The fear was there, pulsing, but she pushed it to the back of her mind, focusing only on finding Dunning. Clara couldn't allow herself to fail. After hours of searching, a faint signal appeared on the screen, guiding Clara to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. She parked her car and entered, feeling the heavy air, thick with a silence that only deepened the tension. Clara walked with steady steps through the dark space, shining her flashlight into forgotten corners and dusty corridors. When she finally reached the center of the warehouse, she saw Dunning for the first time in 10 years. He was there, standing, as if he had been waiting for her. With a cold smile, Dunning watched her silently. Clara kept the flashlight steady, but seeing him made her feel more exposed than ever. Dunning began to speak, revealing that he had known her every move and had been aware of her quest for the truth. It was as though he had been controlling the game from the beginning, manipulating Clara so that she would end up here. Her anger grew with every word, but she waited, watching his every move, searching for an opening to take him down. Then Clara realized that the only way to end this was to use the device in a way she had never tried before. She needed to reverse the technology, and with a quick adjustment, she managed to overload the device, turning it into a pulse that would cause a frequency interference. If it worked, Dunning would be temporarily disoriented, giving her time to act. She activated the device, and the effect was immediate. Dunning staggered back, confused, trying to understand what was happening. Clara seized the moment and moved in, pushing him against a wall as he struggled to regain his senses. Outside, the sound of sirens approached. Clara had sent one last message to the police before she left. But Dunning wasn't finished yet. He broke free, staring at Clara with a hatred that seemed to pierce through her. Clara knew she had only one chance. She adjusted the device again and fired off a final pulse, which made Dunning collapse to the ground, incapacitated. Clara knew the police would arrive in time, but the moment of victory was brief, as the tension and horror of the encounter left her drained. When the officers finally stormed the warehouse, Clara crumpled, letting herself feel a wave of relief as she saw Dunning being taken away in handcuffs. Still, she knew her victory wouldn't erase the traumas she'd faced. Until the last moment, Dunning had stared at her as though he knew this battle wasn't truly over. Days had passed since the confrontation at the warehouse, and Clara was trying to settle back into her routine, though she knew things would never be the same. Defeating Dunning had brought her a temporary sense of relief, but the scars left by the experience still lingered. She knew she had resolved part of the mystery, but she was also aware that Collins's shadow was still looming. Back in the lab, Clara sat in front of the device, now disconnected and dismantled after the showdown. With a sigh, she reflected on everything she'd discovered, the network of crimes, Collins's betrayal, and the perverse use of her research. There was a heaviness in her chest, a sense that the victory had cost more than she'd realized. As she turned off the lab lights, a subtle sound caught her attention. Clara froze, her heart racing. She felt the familiar chill that had haunted her throughout the investigation. During the showdown with Dunning, she'd believed that sense would leave her once everything ended, yet here it was again. Clara moved toward the source of the sound, a small recorder that had been hidden among stacks of papers. She picked it up carefully and pressed play, as the silence in the lab grew almost unbearable. What she heard made her shudder. It was Collins's voice, recorded before his disappearance. "Clara, You know this isn't over. I'll always be one step ahead. The words were a reminder that, even defeated, Collins had left behind a trail of uncertainty and fear, as if he'd known she would find it and continue searching for answers. Clara knew that Collins was still out there and that she might never find him, but she also knew he was watching her, waiting for some sign that she would come after him. The thought that he was somewhere, monitoring her every move, was a burden she would have to carry. She walked to the window, looking out over the city lights. Dunning's fate was sealed, but Collins's remained an enigma. A mystery that, perhaps, she would never solve. For a moment, Clara wondered if she would ever find peace, or if Collins's ghost would follow her forever. With one last look around the lab, Clara decided to step away from the project. Leaving the device disconnected was the only way to keep that cycle of obsession and horror from continuing. Still, she knew that the desire for answers might one day draw her back, to face what was left of the past. As she left, the recorder played one final sound, a whisper, barely audible, but Clara heard it clearly. "See you soon." She knew that the journey might not have a true end, but she was ready to live with the uncertainties. As terrifying as it was, this was the life she had chosen. Collins's voice, now just an echo in the silence, would be a constant reminder of the price she had paid to get here. Clara closed the door to the lab and stepped into the night, leaving behind the shadows that, somehow, would always follow her.